There's a story you were probably told without ever realizing it. It's printed on museum walls, buried in textbooks, woven into every timeline of human progress you've ever seen. It goes like this. First, we wandered. Then we farmed. Then we built cities. And from there, civilization. Laws, kings, writing, order was inevitable. It sounds so simple, so clean. Like history itself was waiting for us to become what we were meant to be. But lately, the ruins have started to argue back. Cities of wood and clay without social stratification, hunter-gatherers ruling from stone towns, prehistoric princes buried with honors. Not hypotheticals, real finds that refuse the tidy ladder we memorized in school. Archaeologists are unearthing cities without king, temples without priests, and villages that grew into metropolises, then burned themselves down, deliberately, only to rebuild again. Burials of children draped in jewels long before the first plow. Foragers who built monuments before they ever planted a field. And societies that looked, for a time, more equal, more free, and more complex than the empires that came after them. The evidence doesn't trace a ladder. It sketches a maze. So what if the birth of civilization wasn't a single dawn, but 1,000 small experiments? A million attempts to answer the oldest question of all. How should we live together? That's the story this episode will tell. Not the rise of civilization, but the fall of a myth. The myth that progress had only one direction, that hierarchy was destiny. That once we planted wheat, we planted the seed of every empire to come. Because when you look close enough, the first civilizations weren't triumphs of order, they were revolutions of imagination. And many of them, when given the choice between kings and freedom, walked away. Every civilization story starts with a map that looks like progress. You've seen it 100 times. Tiny stick figures with spears, then villages, then pyramids, then the skyline of modernity. A staircase of inevitability. A world that moves only one way, upward, forward, smarter, stronger. But that map isn't history. It's a mirror. The ladder we learned. Hunter-gatherer, farmer, city dweller, citizen. Was drawn in the 19th century in the age of steam, empire, and colonial anthropology. Back then, civilization didn't mean complexity. It meant us, Europe, industry, control. To climb that ladder was to move toward whiteness, order, and reason. The unspoken scale by which everyone else was measured. This was the age of Lewis Henry Morgan's Ancient Society, which divided humanity into savagery, barbarism, and civilization. The same logic Karl Marx would later fold into his Stages of Economic Development. Each society fated to evolve the same way, from tribe to state to industry. And when archaeologist V. Gordon Childe coined the term Neolithic Revolution in the 1930s, it seemed to clinch the story. One great leap from foraging to farming, from chaos to order, from prehistory to history. The story fit perfectly with the age that told it. Linear, confident, industrial. Even the checklist phrase fast. The Inca ran a continent-scale empire without alphabetic writing, using quipu, knotted cords, for census, tax, and logistics. So much for writing or bust. And yes, it worked beautifully, partly because the theory was traced around its favorite cases, like painting a bullseye after the arrow hits the barn door. But the more we've dug into the past, the more that ladder starts to crack. Because for every Egypt or Mesopotamia, there were dozens of worlds that didn't fit the pattern, and were erased for it. Whole coastal cultures lost to rising seas, complex foragers who never built empires, so their ruins were left unnamed. Continents like Africa and South America, under-excavated, underfunded, missing from the global narrative almost entirely. As anthropologists Manveer Singh and Luke Glowacki pointed out in 2021, the entire foundation of our nomadic and egalitarian past rests on a handful of ethnographic outliers, tiny forager groups pushed into ecological margins by states and colonialism. They weren't time capsules of prehistory. They were survivors of it. So when we use them to model what the Paleolithic looked like, we're not reconstructing origins, we're reconstructing aftermath. And archaeology itself carries the same bias. Coastal plains, where rich forager societies once thrived, are now underwater. Caves preserve bones, so we assume everyone lived in them. Europe was easy to dig, so Europe became the default setting for all of human history. In reality, as Singh and Glowacki put it, early human societies were socially diverse, multiscalar, and fluid, which is academic code for we have no idea how weird they really were. But one thing's clear. The story of civilization wasn't written by the first city builders. It was written by the last colonizers. And the map they left us, that neat staircase from primitive to civilized, was never a description. It was a verdict. In 1899, Rudyard Kipling even gave it a slogan, "The White Man's Burden," a poem dressed as policy brief.
Take up the white man's burden, send forth the best ye breed. Go bind your sons to exile to serve your captives' need. To wait in heavy harness on fluttered folk and wild, your new-caught sullen peoples, half devil and half child.
Not only does it justify colonization, it demonizes the local populations as well. We didn't just inherit that ladder from nowhere. It was built step by step inside empires. In the late 1700s, Scottish Enlightenment thinkers like Adam Smith and Adam Ferguson sketched a four-stage story of humanity: hunter, herder, farmer, commercial citizen. By 1871, E.B. Tyler's primitive culture gave civilization a scientific sheen. By 1877, Lewis Henry Morgan's ancient society locked the rungs in place. Savagery arrow barbarism arrow civilization. Herbert Spencer and other social evolutionists folded in biology, turning difference into destiny. Once you place Europe at the top of that staircase, conquest starts to look like tutoring. In 1884 to 85, the Berlin Conference carved Africa on a map. French administrators spoke of the mission civilisatrice. British writers praised the civilizing of backward races. In lecture halls, G.W.F. Hegel had already dismissed sub-Saharan Africa as outside history. On the ground, those ideas licensed very practical things: forced labor, land seizure under terra nullius, residential schools, and customary law redesigned to fit colonial courts. Anthropology didn't stay still. By 1911, Franz Boas attacked unilineal evolution and argued for cultural relativism. In the 1920s to 30s, Malinowski and Mead turned fieldwork toward lived complexity. After World War II, the scaffolding shook further, UNESCO statements on race. And by 1982, Eric Wolf's Europe and the People Without History flipped the script. The peoples labeled without history had been inside world history all along, which means the staircase was never a discovery. It was a policy. And once you see that, the ruins read differently, not as waypoints on a single road, but as proof there were always other roads. If the map of progress were true, size should equal hierarchy. Once people settled, the story goes, they needed chiefs to manage them, priests to guide them, kings to command them. But the ground says otherwise. Across the forest steppe of Ukraine, archaeologists have been finding something extraordinary: cities that shouldn't exist. They date back 6,000 years, centuries before the pyramids or Sumerian ziggurats. And they're massive. Majdanetska, Talyanki, Nebelivka, each spread across hundreds of hectares, dense enough to rival ancient Athens. But look closer, and the impossible detail appears. No palaces, no fortresses, no royal burials. The houses, thousands of them, are nearly identical in size, arranged in concentric rings, each with its own hearth, storage bit, and courtyard. At the center, not a throne, but a temple. Vast, communal, symmetrical, a place not of power but of gathering. This was the Cucuteni Trypillia culture, the people who built cities before kings, and they did it without writing, money, or armies. Archaeologists call them Trypillia/Cucuteni megasites for a reason. Tens of thousands of residents. And the strangest tell isn't a palace, it's ash. About every 60 to 80 years, people torched whole house blocks so intensely the clay daub vitrified, then rebuilt on the glow. Collapse? Maybe not. It looks more like an urban reset button. Archaeologist John Chapman calls them megasites of cooperation. Tens of thousands of people coordinating building cycles, trade, and rituals, all without signs of coercive rule. Their cities lived, burned, and were rebuilt, deliberately, every few generations. Not as collapse, but as renewal, a kind of urban breathing. When the Dawn of Everything revisited these findings, David Graeber and David Wengrow saw something astonishing. Urbanism doesn't require hierarchy. You can scale complexity without tyranny. Their book calls this political play. The idea that people experimented with social forms, sometimes egalitarian, sometimes authoritarian, toggling between them like seasonal software. Even the layouts tell the story. In Majdanecka, the circular streets spiral inward, but they never end in a palace. They end in open space, shared ground. It's a vision that turns our assumptions inside out. The first large cities weren't built to serve kings. As Graeber and Wengrow argue, kings appeared when we forgot how else to organize them. The same paradox shows up far from Europe. At Çatalhöyük in Anatolia, 9,000 years ago, people lived stacked wall to wall, rooftops serving as streets, without evidence of rulers or social classes. At Poverty Point in Louisiana, 5,000 years ago, hunter-gatherers built monumental earthworks the size of Egyptian pyramids, with no sign of agriculture, bureaucracy, or kingship. These are not outliers. They're the rule we've ignored. Graeber and Wengrow described them as cities that were politically self-conscious, collective projects of freedom, places where people proved, again and again, that scale didn't have to mean subjugation. So maybe civilization didn't begin with power. Maybe it began with the question of how much of it we were willing to share. We tend to think of farming as the hinge of history, the moment everything changed. Once we planted seeds, the story goes, the rest was inevitable. Villages, cities, kingdoms, history itself. But not everyone agreed to the deal. Across the world, people settled down without surrendering to agriculture. They built homes, raised monuments, and traded across continents, all while living from wild plants, fish, and game. In the Levant, 12,000 years ago, a culture called the Natufians did exactly that. At a site in Jordan called Wadi Mataha II, archaeologists found traces of their world: stone houses, hearths, grinding stones, and the bones of animals they hunted. They made bread from wild barley and wheat. They carved ornaments, buried their dead, even kept dogs, but they never crossed the line into full-time farming. When the climate turned colder, the Younger Dryas, a millennium-long drought, they didn't double down, they diversified. They broadened their diets, switched to smaller game, expanded plant processing. It wasn't stagnation, it was strategy. Anthropologist Anna Bodsgaard and her team called it a flexible economy, a way to stay sedentary without becoming dependent. And that pattern repeats everywhere. And then there's Göbekli Tepe, 11,000 years ago. T-pillars carved with animals, a hilltop complex raised by foragers, not farmers. No domesticated plants, no herds, just coordination on a scale the old model said was impossible. Nearby sites: Karahan Tepe, Navali Chori, Bonkuklu Tarla, with one of the earliest known sewer systems, repeat the pattern. Heavy stone, heavy organization, zero cereal fields. In Japan, the Jomon lived in villages for thousands of years, made exquisite pottery, and built rituals around cedar forests and the sea. They fished, gathered, stored food, but never took up cereal agriculture. In North America, the builders of Poverty Point hauled millions of cubic meters of earth into vast concentric ridges, forming a landscape-sized amphitheater, centuries before anyone there planted crops. Even the Calusa of Florida ruled a coastal chiefdom from fish pens and shell islands, commanding tribute and armies with no fields at all. A 16th century castaway, Hernando de Escalante Fontaneda, lived 17 years among the Calusa. Well, more like enslaved after a shipwreck, but you know, back then shit happened. All other members of the crew and passengers were killed by the Calusa, and he ended up being the sole survivor thanks to his dance moves. This isn't a joke. The story of this guy was way too weird for me not to mention. What's interesting is his account of the Calusa's everyday life, confirmed by archaeology, that described fish pen infrastructure, shell mound palaces, and a ranked society powered by seafood, not cereal. These were not failed farmers, and they never planned on becoming ones. They were successful non-farmers. Each of them showed that you could have abundance without ownership, architecture without kings, and monuments without grain. James C. Scott, in Against the Grain, would later point out why this mattered. Cereal crops like wheat and barley weren't just food. They were legible. You could count them, tax them, store them, seize them. They made states possible. But the Natufians, the Jomon, and the others? They built complexity that couldn't be taxed, communities that couldn't be easily ruled, what Scott might call civilization without surveillance. And when the climate shifted or the politics soured, they could pack up, move on, and start over. Something most empires would later forget how to do. So maybe the agricultural revolution wasn't a beginning. Maybe it was a narrowing, the moment we stopped remembering there were other ways to live. We like to think inequality crept in quietly. That once people built surplus, someone kept more than their share, and that was it. The birth of hierarchy, the first boss, the first crown. But the record tells a stranger story. Because when inequality first appeared, it didn't stay. It came and went, like a season. At sites like Sungir in Russia, estimated 34 to 36,000 years ago, archaeologists found 2 children buried head-to-head, wrapped in thousands of ivory beads, fox teeth, and carved spears. Each ornament painstakingly made, the kind of grave that screams status. But there's no palace above it, no line of kings, just a few isolated graves like sparks in the dark. At other sites, like Arena Candide in Italy or Dolny Viestonice in Moravia, similar patterns emerge. Lavish burials amid otherwise egalitarian surroundings. No clear ruling class, no dynasty. For most of prehistory, hierarchy looks more like a performance than a system. So, status? Yes. Systems of status? Not necessarily. The graves flare, the palaces don't appear. Graeber and Wengrow describe it beautifully. People alternated between forms of organization. Egalitarian in one season, hierarchical in another. When resources were scarce or ceremonies required coordination, someone led. When the feast ended, they stepped down. It wasn't revolution, it was rhythm. In some Arctic societies, even today, leadership works this way. The best hunter commands during the hunt, then goes back to being nobody when it's done. Authority was a role, not a right. A costume, not a crown. Archaeologist David Wengrow calls these systems seasonal sovereignty, winter hierarchies, summer egalitarianism, power as something you could take off. That's why inequality doesn't fossilize easily. It left no permanent palaces, just traces of temporary authority, like footprints in snow. Even the grand burials, the beaded children of Sungir, may have been ritual theater, not royal inheritance. A community playing with symbols of rank the same way we play with myths or masks. And then, when the ritual ended, they returned to life as equals. The deeper you look, the clearer it becomes. For tens of thousands of years, humans experimented with power without getting trapped in it. Hierarchy wasn't a law, it was a phase. And if it came and went before, maybe it still can. For most of our history, we could walk away. If a chief became cruel, if a leader grew arrogant, people simply packed up and left. The world was open. Freedom was a direction, not a dream. And then something changed. Around 6,000 years ago, the first states appeared. In Mesopotamia, Egypt, China. As Scott argues, they emerged not from progress, but from a new crisis. How to hold people still. In Against the Grain, political scientist James C. Scott calls early states population machines. As Scott argues, this is a model, not a law, but it fits the archives uncomfortably well. Their goal wasn't to enlighten or protect, it was to extract, to measure fields, count heads, and tax harvests. And the tool that made it possible wasn't bronze or writing. It was grain. Wheat and barley grew in dense, visible fields. Easy to survey, easy to store, easy to seize. Root crops like yams or potatoes, too hard to count. Hunting, fishing, foraging, too mobile. But grain could be weighed, divided, taxed. It was the perfect food for bureaucrats. And so people were drawn, or driven, into the floodplains of the Tigris, the Nile, the Yellow River. There, their labor could be measured, their movement controlled. The irony is almost cruel. As Scott memorably puts it, agriculture didn't domesticate plants, it domesticated us. Once you depend on annual harvests, you can't simply walk away. The soil owns you, the calendar owns you, the granary owns you. That's why the first city walls weren't built to keep invaders out. They were built to keep labor in, as per Scott's argument. He calls these early states fragile ecologies of control. They rose fast, collapsed often, and left behind skeletons of fields and canals, salinized and sick. Archaeology shows it again and again. Within a few centuries, populations plummet, the cities burn, and when they do, people flee, back to the forests, the hills, the swamps, to the barbarian zones, as later empires would call them. Those zones weren't chaos, they were refuge. Freedom lived there, messy, mobile, uncounted. And yet every time the state collapsed, it rebuilt itself, because power had learned a new trick: permanence. Once it found a way to enclose people, through grain, writing, taxation, it didn't let go. The deal that had once been seasonal became eternal. The costume became a uniform. The phase became the system. And so, what began as a clever experiment, counting crops, recording debts, became the architecture of captivity. The earliest civilizations weren't built with bricks. They were built with boundaries. If you strip history of its noise, the dynasties, inventions, and wars, what you find underneath is choice. For most of human existence, people chose how to live, and they changed their minds often. They moved between mobility and settlement, between equality and hierarchy, between worship and doubt. They rewrote their own rules, and when those rules stopped serving them, they left. David Graeber and David Wengrow called these the three fundamental freedoms: the freedom to move, to disobey, and to reshape society itself. Everywhere archaeologists look, they find traces of these freedoms. Villages burned ritually to start fresh. Communities that alternated between chiefdom and council depending on the season. Cities like Trypillia that dismantled themselves on purpose, refusing to ossify into kingdoms. Even in the icebound caves of prehistory, people left symbols that feel like reminders. Hands pressed on stone saying, "We were here," not to immortalize a ruler, but to mark a moment of being. Even the word civilization stumbles here. Child's 1950 checklist, writing, palaces, bureaucracy, explains some paths, excludes others. Maybe the term should flex, or we should admit there were civilizations without the usual furniture. But over time, those freedoms narrowed. Walls became borders, councils became courts, chiefs became kings. The ability to walk away turned into exile, and the right to disobey became a crime. The irony is that these restrictions didn't come from weakness. They came from success. Once systems worked, we stopped questioning them. Once fields yielded grain, we stopped roaming. Once leaders kept order, we forgot we had ever ordered ourselves. As Singh and Glowacki note in their 2021 paper, human psychology didn't evolve for submission. It evolved for flexibility. We were built to navigate shifting alliances, small networks, and improvisation. That's why modern life often feels alien. Our minds were forged in diversity, yet trapped in monotony. Maybe that's why we keep dreaming of other worlds. The city in balance with nature, the egalitarian community that still scales, the place where freedom and complexity coexist. Because deep down, we remember. We've done it before. We just forgot that we could. So let's go back to that first story, the one in every museum, every school book, every timeline. The ladder of progress, the march from foragers to farmers to kings. It's clean, it's comforting, and it's wrong. Human history isn't a staircase. It's a landscape, a maze of trails that crisscross, double back, and disappear into the dark. Some led to cities without rulers, some to farmers who refused to farm, some to egalitarian empires that dismantled themselves on purpose. And yes, some to cages made of grain and taxes and power. But none of it was destiny. Every age that came before us had options, paths that were tried, tested, abandoned, or forgotten. We just happened to inherit the ones that survived, not because they were better, but because they were harder to escape. If there's a lesson buried in those ruins, it's this: civilization didn't begin when we built walls. It began when we learned we could take them down. So the next time someone tells you history only moves in one direction, that inequality, control, and hierarchy are just the price of progress, remember this: the first civilizations were never supposed to exist. They were choices, and choices can be made again. If this story changed the way you think about our past, or about what's possible in our future, hit that like button, share the video, and subscribe for more echoes from the deep time of humanity. And tell us in the comments, do you think we could go back to a different system now? Till next time, keep listening to the echoes.